Hey everyone, welcome to our special video on the rubric. This is the part of module 3 that we punted to this asynchronous video. So this is all about how to guide the conversations, weigh the various KSAs in order to debrief through those lenses and anchors after you've done an interview. So it's really a tool that, in Katrina's brilliance, has like tied all of this stuff together and helps to guide conversations that many times they're just like free for alls. Like, oh, how do you feel about this? I had a good feeling, or I think so. And so as you'll see in the rubric conversation, there's like some real beauty in this tool. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So this is really, Katrina, over to you on the rubric.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. I think you've touched a little bit on why a rubric, but I just want to dive a little bit deeper in that. And part of this is in our quest for consistency, we found that an assessment rubric was really useful because it, first of all, guides committee members through specific questions for each candidate in light of the role. So this isn't necessarily like, I really liked them, or they were funny, or all of those kinds of things. But when you think about those KSAs, those key anchors, the kind of values, characteristics, kind of thought, leadership that role might need to have, it really helps to have some consistent questions. So the rubric, offers a standardized framework to ensure that you're assessing each candidate in a consistent way. And the other function of it is it's actually a way, possibly if you haven't used one before, that the hiring committee actually experiences an alternative to a traditional debrief or a traditional way of working through that. So this is something new. It can feel like it is extra on top of, and so you may experience some resistance to kind of filling it out and referring to it. You can decide as you move through whether those are pieces that the lead of the search wants to have people submit back so that you have that record, or whether you bring that into conversation and sort of trust that everybody's everybody's used the process and work with it in that way. So again, there's a bit of a bespoke approach, but really the goal is to help everybody stay focused on what's really important in the role and how those things are showing up within that candidate experience of the interview. The reason that the way that we have worked with this is we've actually asked people to share their scores, but not necessarily their comments. So not necessarily sort of their notes underneath or their evidence, but we've drawn that out in the conversations following the interviews. And so we get a chance to look at the scores individually, aggregate them and bring them together. And then we were able to use that to help us with reference points to ping, our memories or our observations that were tracked on those rubric forms. So there's lots of ways you can choose to use this. So there's basically 4 different types of rubrics, and really 2 of these are ones that we would recommend for a hiring process. So the first one is a holistic rubric. And so it's really useful because it offers a single scale, and all the criteria that you're looking to learn about in the interview are considered together. So this might be scoring criteria out of the same number of points. Each criteria or each KSA that you're testing in that first interview, for example, you might score that on a scale of 1 to 5, and then have an opportunity to give some evidence or some commentary about that. And then at the end, you'd say, we had these 3 KSA areas or these 3 key anchors we were testing for. And so each of those is scored out of 5. The total score weighting for that candidate is out of a 15-point tally. And so you would use sort of the same type of scale as you move through, and then add those together, and that would be your total. The analytical rubric is really useful for determining where candidates are or maybe are not successful in meeting the position requirements. And you can actually assess the importance of those. You can weigh them differently. And so, for example, if the scoring is out of 100% with different components weighted differently in the long run, we might say that having certain knowledge is the most important and worth 50% of the total weighting. Whereas an ability to perform a skill or actually kind of do a task is actually only weighted at 10%. And so that way you're getting sort of relative ratings for each of those different things you're trying to assess, and able to have a different way of weighting those candidates in the long run. I'll just mention here a couple of other different rubrics that you may find useful throughout sort of a search process, and that we wouldn't necessarily recommend for the interview process. So those are checklists and developmental rubrics. So a checklist we kind of think might be more suitable for an onboarding kind of a piece. So from the organizational side, it's what needs to be done to make sure that you're ready to welcome that new employee when they start work. What information do they need accessible when they begin? What kind of access do they need? Do they have their equipment? Are they set up properly? All of those kinds of things that will help ensure that when that employee lands, they aren't struggling or wrestling with how to get that information so that they can actually start to dive in. On the candidate side, or on the new employee side, a checklist could also be really valuable to help them be able to respond to any initial questions or actions that you might need them to do. And so they might need to collect a certain kind of information for themselves in order to register for their benefits or weigh in on some of the different pieces that you might need them to. They might need, a kind of high level bio maybe that speaks to them and their role, or they might need to work with a marketing team for the release or announcement of their appointment. And so there are ways that you can use a checklist just to help make sure you're getting all of those things down and then really preparing for that new employee and that new relationship. Developmental rubric might be more suitable for performance reviews. And so if you have a conversation, and we'll get into this a little bit more in our conversation about onboarding, but if you have the KSAs or those key anchors, and there are areas where you're really acknowledging that there's some developmental work that candidate might need to do, you might set up a developmental rubric to help identify where those learning curves are. And that might help you then assess, how do we support this employee, or how do we support the organization in helping to make this match a success. Okay. So when we're thinking about rubric design, specifically for those holistic and analytical rubrics, there are 3 basic things we want to pay attention to. So the first one is to identify the criteria that you want to pay attention to and to actually track going forward. So if you remember the key concepts for the role, that list of brainstorming questions we asked you to do that highlighted, how might we ask questions to help understand the KSAs? How might we ask questions to help us understand those key anchors or other concepts? And then we had asked you in that weekly challenge, to think about theming or sorting and identifying some kind of a pattern or way through that you could identify a focus for the specific interview. So when we did the Upper Philadelphia search, we focused the first interview on assessing the 3 anchors of the position. So those became our criteria. We were really most curious in that first interview to learn about the candidate's personal connection and experience that related to opera, the arts, or the city of Philadelphia. We were really interested in exploring the in-depth understanding, expertise, and practices in anti-racism, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we were, on the third, really interested in learning about their in-depth understanding, experience, and practice in HR environments. So we selected questions that would help us to be able to weigh those criteria. So the second thing that we look at in rubric design is actually selecting that rating scale to weight the candidate responses to the criteria. So this is where you or the committee might have a conversation around, what is most important? Is there sort of a hierarchy of importance in the things you're trying to learn, or are they, equally important for your ability to kind of consider whether that candidate moves forward? So if they're all equally important, you may opt for a holistic rubric. If there is a hierarchy of importance, you would probably go for one of those analytical rubrics like we just mentioned. So for Upper Philadelphia, we used a holistic rubric. Each one of these anchors was seen to be of equal importance in the long run. So each member of the committee assessed each candidate on a scale of 1 to 5 for each anchor. We asked the committee to make notes about the evidence they were basing their assessment on, what they saw, what they heard, what questions they're still sitting with. And then we combined those total points for a score out of 15 and used a weighting to determine if the candidate was eligible to move forward, or whether we were recommending that candidate move forward. So if they scored, in the first that like 12 to 15 points, this was considered an exceptional candidate that was exceeding our expectations. And so we definitely knew we wanted to move them forward. If somebody had that sort of 10 to 12 ranking, we would consider them a strong candidate. Underneath that, it was either candidates met minimum criteria or the candidate didn't actually meet the minimum criteria. And so we could look at those combined points from each committee member, and we could look at that holistically. And that really helped to inform our debriefs and really helped to bring in the different perspectives on why certain committee members might have rated higher or lower than others. And that really generated a really great conversation. The third component to designing a rubric is offering the indicators to frame how the committee should use the rating scale. So this is just, providing some examples. You might see or you might hear, they might, have terms or language or examples that they might put in as you move through. And these would be indicators or evidence that you can see and hear that allow them to create their assessment, to assign that number of points. So at the end of each round of interviews, what we recommend is really bringing that committee together for a debrief. And so you're actually looking at the assessments for each candidate and looking at those weighted rubrics overall to help to determine which candidates will move forward to the next round. So the rubric is really helpful because it creates a data set. So if we start to notice that you're getting into that territory that moves away from the KSAs or moves away from the key anchors or those criteria that you had developed, this brings you a chance to bring back to the data that's in front of you. You can provide a preliminary analysis of what you noticed as the person who was sort of aggregating all of that, or you can pull out from different people in the committee, what did you hear? What did you most respect about this candidate? What did you see? That question of what question do you still have, or what questions are you still holding about this candidate in relationship to this role? Super important, because that might shift the way that you move forward in the questions for the second round. So if you need to expand on something or go deeper on something, or you need to you're noticing a trend that, these candidates that we want to move forward, we still have these general questions about that. So how does that impact? How do we sort of iterate on that into that second round of interviews? So this is also a point where, you might have a plan for first round, second round, third round, but you might need to pause and just reassess and really confirm or validate that your next step is actually the next step that is informed by the data that you're receiving through these debrief conversations and these data sets you're receiving. The conversation around what challenged you or gave you pause, this is one of those things that was really interesting as we move through the 3 interviews. And part of the reason why we recommend that, that 3 interview model, because there may have been very few challenges for some folks in the first interview. They nailed all those answers. They were a really good performer. And then others that gave you pause. But then you might notice that those things are shifting, that you're starting to see different kinds of patterns come out as you move through. And so really sort of highlighting those weak signals in that first interview, and watch what gets stronger or what starts to fade away as you move through the different rounds of interviews will help you get a better grasp sort of a little bit more objectively on each candidate and their weighting overall in light of the role. And then finally, that question is, okay, based on your assessment, based on the group assessment, would you recommend this candidate move forward in the process? And this is really interesting. If you have scores that are really close together, this might be a really quick conversation. And if you have scores that are really far apart, this might take a little bit longer. And so it really does sort of bring you back to how are decisions made in this process, and how, are you driving for consensus, or is somebody going to be making the call? And if someone's making the call, how does the committee, work to trust and understand that way forward? So this is one of those places where distribution of power really shows up, and one of those places you can really watch just to see and get a kind of overall temperature or flavor for how the committee is working and how that process is moving. And you may have to adapt based on what you're learning or seeing in that phase. And that's about the rubric.